Hello, everyone, and welcome to Newchip Fireside Chat. For those tuning in for the first time, Newchip is a remote global accelerator that has provided over 1,000 plus founders with all the tools and skills necessary to fund, build, and scale in any industry. Today, we have a very special guest to talk about all things space, venture capital, and what startup is going to the moon next. So I want to introduce Jeff Crusey from Seraphim Capital. How are you today, Jeff?
I'm doing all right. Thanks, Bryce. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me.
Well, can't wait. We're super excited to talk about space. You want to go ahead and give us a little bit information on your background?
Yeah, so I started off my career, like many of my classmates, when I graduated in investment banking, but focused on biomedical device investment banking because I'd spent my summers working at a lab running clinical trials. I was just a tech. I wasn't designing anything, but familiar with some of the technologies there. Gravitated towards earlier stage companies, and around 2008, decided that I wasn't very excited by investment banking anymore. I wanted to help create value, but also put some more of my core values to practice. So, growing up in San Diego, surfing every morning, environment and conservation, core values of mine. So that just naturally pushed me in the direction of climate tech venture capital. So November 2008, I actually decided against joining any of the Silicon Valley firms. I didn't feel like enough of them had the background I was looking for to invest intelligently into climate tech. I actually opted to join a corporate venture arm of a utility in Detroit, Michigan, of all places. So November 2008, when the market was falling apart, I moved to Detroit, Michigan, but wouldn't trade it for the world. So worked on climate tech investments for almost 5 years before I wanted to go get some operational technical experience. Spent a little bit of time in Brazil helping open up the solar market before I did some semiconductor process engineering training. And then I joined a startup working on micro LED micro displays and turning those into products for AR and VR. After which point, I went to a few other startups, eventually co-founded my own in AR VR, sold that to one of the big tech companies out on the West Coast, and soon after joined Viasat, a more traditional satellite communications company in San Diego. And not long after I joined Viasat, I was recruited over to Seraphim, where I joined the team early 2020 and have been there since.
Wow, that's amazing. It's quite the journey. And I think it's super exciting. And I think that's something we can come back to in a little bit, because the idea of sustainability in space is really a hot topic right now. That's kind of hard to understand. When people see these rocket launches, they think it's super wasteful. But as you see things like reusable rockets and kind of the changes in fuel, space is doing a lot to kind of build sustainability in a lot of ways that may not be obvious to the public. So would love to come back to that. But I think that's a really fascinating kind of story, and excited to dive deeper. I wanted to ask you really quick, just kind of like, what are some of the things you're following in space right now? Like, what do you think is super exciting? Because we have space billionaires going off to space. We have companies going SPACs like left and right. So what are some things that are exciting you right now?
Yeah, so I think one of the things that you brought up was sort of sustainability. And that, in terms of taking care of our orbits, is something I think about a lot. So how do we keep orbits clean, prevent these catastrophic collisions that create debris fields and sort of ruin it for the rest of us? So that's something I think a lot about. And one of the companies that I'm a board observer of is really trying to tackle that issue early on. Deorbit is it's part of their roadmap to figure out how to clean up and make space more sustainable, because it really could be one collision that cascades into another and creates a massive headache for all of us. And better to get out in front of the issue than let it get to that point. Another area that's really interesting, and I've been interested actually since like 2012, when I first mentored a company working on orbit manufacturing. And I think that's actually a really interesting space, because there's genuinely a lot that we cannot actually create terrestrially that we can in orbit. And it's really fascinating to me because if something like that was available to me when I was working on micro LED micro displays, it just would have fundamentally changed my entire approach. So that's something that I think is really interesting. Can't wait for that to develop more. Albeit it's in very very early stages, embryonic. And so another thing I think a lot about also is, maybe a year ago, a lot of people would think anything beyond Earth was sort of a category that was uninvestable because it was too far out in terms of time horizons. And now that we're at this place in time or in history that we arrived at with the Falcon 9. The Falcon 9 dropped the cost of launch dramatically. And, Starship is right around the corners. And what are the implications of that? And that could imply that, all of a sudden, things like the cislunar economy become, a reality, and that it's actually not that far away. And maybe we need to start thinking about it now as investors. So that's sort of the other area that's pretty exciting to me still.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's just so many amazing things going on in space right now. Some of the things that are just seeing, both on the technology side, we have reusable rockets. We're having these massive constellations, smart constellations that are moving around. You talked about manufacturing in space, and that starts from making perfect ball bearings on the small scale, and then here in the future, that's how we get to these mega starships that can go interplanetary that you kind of see in science fiction. So there's really amazing things coming on the technology side. And then on the venture side, I mean, you have over, I believe, $5.5 billion invested in space last year. SpaceX is the second largest venture-backed company in the US. We have 8 space tech companies planning on going public through a SPAC merger, really amazing things on the investing side too. So I was curious to kind of navigate over to what are some of the unique things you see on the investing side? You talked a little bit about how people didn't see space as being an investable area. How has that changed in the past few years?
There's definitely a lot more attention paid to it today. And I think there's a few factors that are causing that. One of them is everybody's witnessed firsthand the success of SpaceX. And so I think there's a bit of a hangover from investors that weren't able to participate early on in SpaceX, and they're now looking for their next SpaceX. Maybe that's not the right approach, but that's some of the logic I think people are following in terms of seeking venture returns. I would say there's definitely also the cult of Elon. He is a very popular individual that garners a lot of attention, and I think as a result has brought more attention towards space tech investing, especially at the earlier stages. And so we see lots of people that probably wouldn't have paid attention to space, angel investing or pre-seed investing into space tech companies. Another thing that's changed, maybe it's not that it's changed, but we are sort of in historically low interest rates. And that causes people to seek, returns outside of debt, so moving more towards equity. And so I think you're seeing a lot more money available to these, what are probably longer time horizon, more capital intensive propositions, winning investment. And then I think, big one that you pointed out was actually, up till recently, there wasn't a lot of liquidity for space tech companies. There weren't a lot of big exits. And SPACs, despite what people think of them, are actually pretty uniquely aligned for space tech companies in providing liquidity so we can actually continue to invest in the sector, but also providing a large chunk of money for these capital intensive companies that can go heads down and develop and go to market without having to go out and spend inordinate amounts of time raising funding.
Yeah, absolutely. To kind of come back to the cult of Elon, I was about to wear my Occupy Mars shirt today before we hopped on. But it's something interesting to kind of people that see, like, when they look at space investing, the first thing and sometimes the only thing that they think about is launch vehicle providers or rockets. And they think, so we have Rocket Lab, we have SpaceX, Blue Origin, all these amazing Rocket Lab companies, but space is so much more than that. And I would love to hear kind of your opinion on what are the different sectors of space that you think are kind of underrepresented due to kind of this following of Elon and big, kind of amazing rockets, though, that can kind of be big and loud in the industry.
Yeah, so I think you're right. I mean, we've got a lot of launch companies, a lot of them, and so they get most of the attention. But there's a lot of the things that they're launching into orbit. So there's kind of three broad categories of satellites that they're launching, which are the first one's satellite communications, so Starlink, amongst other satellite communications constellations. There is then PNT, or position, navigation, and timing. So things like constellations of satellites that do things like GPS does, which is a backbone technology to almost everything we use today, and people aren't even aware of it. And then the third is Earth observation. So putting up a bunch of satellites to look back at Earth, collect a bunch of data, imaging in different bands, and so we can sort of make decisions at a more aggregate level than having just sort of boots in the ground doing surveys. I think those are sort of like the three broad categories that probably don't get all the fame and glory that the launch folks don't get, or that the launch folks get. And then, I think there's a lot of other interesting things that sort of fit in between those, which are things like on-orbit processing, because if you're generating all this data, downlinking it's not the easiest, or you don't always have access to downlinking, and being able to pre-process some of that data so you don't have to downlink as much helps alleviate some of that bottleneck. There's cleaning up orbits. Then there's some of the terrestrial technologies like better, more efficient antennas that can connect to multiple satellites. There's a lot of the technologies that are specialized in processing all of that data, the downstream analytics, so we can make sense of all of that data. There's still a long way to go, because I think we're only in the infrastructure stage. We're just still launching satellites. We have a long way to go, and the downstream portion, the people that are making sense of all this data, are still very early on as well. And so I think as the sector matures, you'll see more and more products downstream that don't really look like space technologies, but they are rooted in space data.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's really some two sides of that coin, where you have all this amazing data that a lot of people don't know comes from spaces, is built around space technology. But even you have some of the hardware. I mean, historically, you look at some of the things that have come out of NASA, with the ballpoint pen, Velcro, microwave, or things like that. And so the space to ground application is really amazing in that things that were intended for just space use end up being very commercial and like household products down the line. And I'm curious, as an investor, when you're looking at some of these startups, how much of that application is kind of part of your process of evaluating these companies?
If I could understand your question a little bit better, are you referring to sort of like the commercial prospects of the business?
Yeah, in terms of going from, I guess, research to commercializing the technology in space, how do you think about that? Is it more of just the viability of will the product work, or does there really need to be a strong kind of fit for that product, either in the space market or even a more commercial market down the line?
Yes. So I think the way we like to think about it is there always has to be some sort of a commercial argument for any of the companies that we invest in. Otherwise, many of these companies could be beholden to small government grants. They never really scale, and they're just sort of like a body shop for government agencies. Which is great. People can make wonderful, livings out of, that kind of a model. But we're looking for venture scale returns. So there definitely has to be this large market that is either there or will be there as a result of their technology. And so I think what we try and do is we try and think about, the stages it takes to eventually achieve scale commercially. And so it definitely starts out with, a very deep and wide moat, technologically speaking, that they validate across a number of milestones, and hopefully that proliferates commercially, and then they achieve scale, all accomplished by what is hopefully the appropriate team. So there's quite a few different factors we look at, but oftentimes we're really scrutinizing those milestones and seeing if those make sense, the timing and how much funding it'll require. And then, I think what's a little bit unique about space is because it is sometimes more capital intensive or a bit more frontier than something like enterprise SaaS. There's a lot of non-dilutive funding that can help sort of de-risk those propositions or alternative funding sources. So the DoD has done an amazing job at ramping their efforts around SBIR grants. There's similarly with NASA, the National Science Foundation, and now because a lot of investors are realizing some of these investments are almost more like infrastructure investments, they're making available debt facilities to sort of better balance the cost of capital from all the equity everybody's been taking on. I think that's another aspect of each investment that we pay close attention to, because we've found a high correlation with companies that are adept at winning a lot of that kind of funding early on and eventual commercial success.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's some great kind of corollaries to what you guys are doing, both like within your portfolio and in the AWS space program that I'd love to talk about here in a minute. But one thing I found that's been really fascinating is I've talked to this early stage space companies. Everybody talks about in VC of like getting to an MVP where you can show the product and working in some form. When you were working with space technology, oftentimes you're needing to prove these technologies work in space. And while the cost of space has come down astronomically, you're still talking about thousands and thousands of dollars per pound just to get something into space. And then you have to wait for a launch just to get there. So when you're an early stage space company, how do you go about proving your technology and showing traction of any form to investors that may or may not happen in space?
Excellent question. And yes, that's a good point. There's oftentimes that chicken and the egg problem, right? And there are creative ways we've worked with some of our companies to not completely clear that hurdle, but somewhat de-risk the proposition or the technology before it actually has to go to space. So what do I mean by that? We worked with a few of our portfolio companies, and they've done this. These are companies that are putting up constellations, and they want to prove out some or de-risk some of their technology before they actually launch. So they'll do things like launch or fly their sensor on an aerial campaign. So putting it on a plane to fly it and show sort of the quality and performance of the data that they believe they'll get, and you can see some of that from flight trials. Then there's obviously sort of the more direct approach where you can maybe fly your payload on a hosted platform before you actually start putting up your constellation. There are a bunch of different things. Another thing that's sort of starting to come to is there are companies have access now to more synthetic data tools, so you can actually show the quality of your analytics on synthetic data before you actually fly your next SAR, thermal infrared imaging satellite, and sort of get ahead of the curve a little bit that way as well.
That's great. Yeah, I think it's been really interesting to see how these pre-seed, because especially when you see companies like SpaceX that have proven their technology, you can see the route forward going from there. But it's that first kind of crossing the chasm, like for space technology, when you're like pre-seed, to understand of how you can get to actually have working technology that's so difficult. And so I wanted to take a moment to actually talk about what you guys are doing both with AWS and within your own portfolio companies. I've seen you guys have companies kind of all the way to like the Series B and C to very early seed stage. And so to talk a little bit about those seed stage companies, what are some things that you guys are doing with them to get to that point where they're hitting scale and actually putting things up into space?
Yeah, so I mean, like I mentioned, doing lots of demos and proofs of concept. I'm helping them think about how they can build a test bed that'll attract potential customers and partners pre-launch. So that's one of the things we work very closely with them on. Also, helping sort of hold our company's hands through the MOD or the DoD. Speaking with the government to help prioritize some of the technologies that we think are really important, and with good argument. But helping garner more non-dilutive funding towards those companies. But then there's also just the benefit of, because we've got a significantly large portfolio of companies that oftentimes, will need the technology of one another, or will have to work cooperatively. So, there is some kind of like force multiplier with having our companies work together. And then lastly, many of our LPs are strategics from the industry. So companies like SES, Airbus, Leonardo. We expose all of our companies very early on to them because they can help them in terms of co-development, commercial partnerships, or commercial channeling, and sometimes even as like co-investors. So there's quite a few things we do, and then for the earliest stage companies, we'll work with them through our accelerator on everything from. I mean, we worked with companies that weren't even formed before they joined our accelerator. Company formation, thinking through strategy, commercialization, basic pitch work, helping them form, a better team before they go out and raise their first round. So there's quite a bit of hands-on work we do, and a lot of that involves just sort of a lot of exposure to, the highest quality stakeholders from the industry and investors as well.
Yeah, because I believe Seraphim is one of the largest space kind of investing. You guys, I kind of started the VC in space, and so seeing kind of how you guys have been developing companies so far, it's been a really fun to watch, and just getting access to space, I think, and making space accessible to so many more people. I think there's going to be some really amazing technologies that kind of come out of that. As you said, we're in the early stages yet, so following that's been really amazing. Is there any other last kind of either challenges or things that you think are unique about the space sector that you think either an entrepreneur or investor should know before they kind of enter into the industry?
I'll kind of share this frustration I have, and this is a happy frustration that I have, but it's space tech oftentimes is sort of in the background. So, I'll give you an example: GPS. We use it all day, every day, all the time, and it's based on these constellations of satellites that we have in orbit. And I think it's taken a bit for granted. And what I get a little bit frustrated with other investors with sometimes is that to think imaginatively about how to move the needle in different markets and technology categories. It is oftentimes helpful to think about it, maybe from, the space perspective, because sometimes you can actually have solutions from, space technologies in other areas like climate or property tech or fintech that you wouldn't normally consider part of that ecosystem, but actually are. And so what I challenge other investors to do is, think a little bit more creatively outside the box when it comes to space tech and how it affects their specific market that they're investing in. Because I think there is a ton that, space tech can do for climate. I think there's a ton that it can do for fintech. I think, and I haven't really seen that from sort of the more general VC community just yet.
Yeah, absolutely. I think in some of the times where I've been working with space companies in the past, and even in a lab, space is inherently like industry agnostic as well as kind of just multidisciplinary. I mean, I've had the amazing opportunity to work with aerospace engineers, but you also need business people in space. There's medicine in space, there's climate, as you said, there's manufacturing, and there's this really amazing kind of variety in space. Space is almost just a replica of what we have here on Earth, just with kind of in a vacuum. And so having all of that there and being grown, I think there's so many different applications for space. And so to kind of go from there, it's there's a lot about space that maybe it seems like there's a barrier to entry, both like from the technology side as well as for on the investment side. So what kind of recommendations would you have to an investor that's looking to break into this space?
I mean, I don't think, just have a little courage, honestly.
Yeah.
Like you said it right when you pointed out how cross-disciplinary space tech really is. And it's very rarely just like strictly space tech. There's RF engineers, there's computer vision data scientists, there's, I mean, all different kinds of disciplines that go into it that actually aren't much different than a lot of other categories of technology. So I would encourage investors to, have a little courage, hear them out, and think creatively about, what the art of what could be. And maybe considering that space is, part of climate tech, or space is part of fintech, space is part of supply chain management, space is a part of all these different things, and to sort of include that in your basket.
Mm-hmm. And I think one of my favorite things about space is this idea of thinking creatively. One of the amazing things about space is it just captures the imagination. Like if you look at science fiction, you look at some of the stories that we tell, like space has always been this big kind of frontier that like always promises this kind of adventure. And so that was always what drew me. I mean, I loved Star Trek as a kid. I love reading science fiction to date. I mean, I have the Saturn V rocket on my desk made out of Legos. And so I'm curious, what excited you about space? Like why did you come into this industry?
That's actually a funny question. So I guess there's the side of me that's a bit of a cynic when it comes to tech. And so I oftentimes will hear these, grandiose announcements about something, and, just sort of in my own way, try and poke holes in it. So like years ago, I think this is like 2011 or 10 or something like that. I saw Facebook posting all these things about, we're going to have balloons and drones flying around, giving everyone internet all over the world. Mm-hmm. And like literally my first thought was like, but what about satellites? Like, doesn't that work pretty well and probably more coverage? And so I went to my friend at the time who worked at a satellite company, and he's just like, actually, it's a little bit of a marketing ploy because they're all trying to figure out how to put up their own constellations right now. And so that was when I just started getting very curious about satellite communications. And then, just sort of going down a rabbit hole and learning more about other aspects of like space tech. So I got really into propulsion for a while there. I got into on-orbit manufacturing. So it wasn't like this like thing where I wanted to be an astronaut my whole life, or I loved sci-fi so much that's what got me into space. I do love sci-fi, by the way, but that's not what got me into it. It was just sort of curiosity, I guess.
Yeah, I think some of the things about this technology is in some of the labs that I worked with. I spent some time with Masten Space Systems. Once you get to see this technology and you hear either the roar of a space engine, or you just kind of see some of the simulations that they're running and how all of it works together, I mean, it's rocket science in a way where like it's deep satellites, AI, like it's fascinating. It kind of just incites your curiosity. And so for me, it's just, as you said, be a little brave, dip your toe in and kind of throw yourself in there. Let the tech just kind of like amaze you in that way and be curious about it. I think there's some really awesome things kind of coming down the pipeline that's going to change what we do up there and kind of what we do down here. So
I will say that one of the things that I couldn't have anticipated was actually it just didn't even occur to me beforehand, which was how cross-disciplinary it was and how much of my previous work actually related to space tech without having even known it. So I'd done a lot of work on semiconductors, so that related directly to the work I'd been doing on orbit manufacturing. And then, a lot of the work I'd done on the AR/VR side in computer vision related directly to what I was, looking at on the Earth observation side. So it was that's what really like kept me. I was just like, wow, it's like not that much different. And so that has been a lot of fun for me so far.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's been taking kind of the first like I took an aerospace engineering class at one point in time just to audit it, and like listening to all of it, and it was like, oh, like this is actually like, as much as they say like, oh, it's not rocket science, like at the end of the day, I think my professor said it's just fancy plumbing. So I mean, it is so cross-disciplinary. There's so much application that people are just coming to realize about it. And so to kind of wrap up in this direction, I was curious, just like, what are you following? We talked about manufacturing in space. We talked about like connected satellites. What are some of the emerging technologies and also trends that you're following and are getting really excited about?
One of the ones I'm really excited about right now it's position, navigation, and timing, or PNTs. It's often referred to. And the reason I'm excited by that is it's really, for the most part, GPS is the US version of GNSS. But there's a European version, and China's working on their version as well. Russia also has theirs. But it's all like a very legacy system. GPS has been around for a long, long, long time. And it's been very, very useful. Like I said, backbone of many of the technologies we use every single day. But it's not that accurate anymore, or accurate enough for the purposes of things like autonomy. Could be off by many meters. It doesn't have a strong signal because it's from a geosynchronous satellite really far away, so it can be jammed and spoofed real easily. And it's not encrypted, so people can tamper with it. And so I'm really excited about what's coming down the pipeline with sort of next generation PNT. And this is more than like the Swift navigations that sort of augment the GPS system. This is like completely new GPS systems. So I'm going to shamelessly plug one of the companies in our portfolio, but Zona Space is really the only company that I know of that's really going after a dedicated PNT constellation, rethinking from first principles how navigation really should work. And so that one's pretty exciting for me. And then also downstream analytics. Shamelessly plug another company in our portfolio. So Chai Predictions. They're using a variety of data sets, including a lot of satellite imagery data, in their proprietary machine learning models to provide very accurate, scarily accurate commodity price predictions. And why is that interesting? Well, we're sort of going through inflation right now. Commodity prices are going through the roof, and so it's putting a lot of value at risk for companies. And by and large, most of them don't have access to tools to hedge any of that risk. But by virtue of using this aggregate data and their machine learning models and getting these price predictions, companies now have an ability or a way to hedge commodity price risk, where they were sort of just stuck taking it from whoever was their supplier. So I think like sort of like the downstream analytics, there's so much to do that we really haven't been able to get a good handle on just yet, because most satellite companies wanted to just bulk sell data versus having to understand that the commercial markets work a bit differently. You actually have to build a product that people find useful, because insurance companies don't have geospatial teams to make sense of satellite data typically. So you have to build it for them.
Yeah, I think there's definitely some amazing routes that are kind of coming out, and seeing the exponential growth of where these companies are going to go. And now that once the technology is proven, the different applications, kind of as we talked about, that multidisciplinary aspect of downstream analytics and even in-orbit manufacturing, I think there's going to be some really cool growth out of that. And so just taking a look at your portfolio company, all the amazing things that Seraphim is doing, what's next for you guys as a VC firm and people in your portfolio? Like, what are you guys looking to do?
Yeah, so we actually just recently IPO'd our fund on the London Stock Exchange, so people can actually buy shares in Seraphim if they want. So that's a big deal to us for a number of reasons. It gets us closer to the scale of a fund that we think is best suited to properly fund space companies from seed through growth. So we have a lot more capital to deploy and can support our companies, longer term. But it also, more importantly, gives us a permanent capital vehicle. So we can, again, continue to invest in companies, but taking a more long-term approach to it, and not being bound by what is typically, the 10-year lifespan of a venture capital fund, with the typical GPLP structure. So it gives us a little bit more freedom in making some of those more moonshot investments.
Yeah, I definitely think the moonshots are what we're here for, and also kind of what makes this so exciting. So to kind of wrap this up a little bit, what would be some of your advice to an entrepreneur that's starting their journey in space?
Definitely. So one of the things I would, I guess the first thing is make sure you got the right team. Don't be afraid to bring a few more people to fill in the major gaps. One of the things I see oftentimes that is a great way to go nowhere fast is a solo founder in space. When, like you said, it's very cross-disciplinary. So having the proper team to cover all sort of the, the technological aspects, the business development aspects, because it's often commercial and government at the same time, and making sure all those gaps are filled across the entire founding team. And then the other one, again, I can't stress it enough, companies that are good at winning grant funding early on, but not being beholden to it, so not being distracted and going off course for it, have oftentimes proved to be the companies that can grow the fastest in space tech. So learn how to apply for grants and keep track of new ones that are coming out.
Yeah, that non-dilutive funding can really be a great signal and assistance to these companies, but also be a great signal to investors looking at your company saying, okay, this is technology that other people believe in and think we're ready to hit that kind of growth and traction stage. So I think that's great advice for future space entrepreneurs, people looking to take the next moonshot. So if you're at that stage of your company, Seraphim Capital is probably the best partner you could have. And if you need the tools and skills to get to that stage, Newchip Accelerator can help you get there. So thank you, Jeff, for your time. I think that's all the questions I have today. It was amazing speaking with you. We had great conversations talking about what's next in space and how to get into space. So really appreciate your time today. And if you anything you'd like to close with, happy to do so.
Just Starship is around the corner. Think about what the world's going to look like when that's here. It's going to be dramatically different. And so start preparing for that version of the future.
Absolutely. Well, thank you again for your time, and super excited to talk with you more and find out what that future is with Starship and everything else. Thanks, Jeff.